If you want to replace grey hydrogen that's used in industry, or if you want to replace natural gas in the gas grid with something, or indeed if you want to replace petrol and diesel for heavy vehicles and transport, the only net zero energy gas is green hydrogen. And at the same time, of course, the cost of renewable power has come down. So the cost of green hydrogen has come down because they're inextricably linked. And as the cost of renewable power comes down, of course, the volume goes up and the need for energy storage goes up.
Hello and welcome to Energy Unplugged by Aurora. This podcast features various experts from Aurora having in-depth conversations with key industry leaders, policymakers and academics from all over the world. It explores the hottest topics across the energy market and gives a unique perspective on major energy issues.
Welcome to the latest episode of Energy Unplugged. I'm Richard Howard, the Research Director at Aurora Energy Research. In this episode, I'll be speaking to Graham Cooley, who's the CEO of ITM Power, a role that he's had for the last 12 years. ITM Power is one of the leading manufacturers of hydrogen electrolysers, based with its GigaStack factory facility in Sheffield in the UK. In his 12 years in the company, Graham has overseen the growth of ITM Power from initial product development right through to now being one of the leading players in the electrolyser space with a market capitalisation of around £3 billion. Welcome to the podcast, Graham.
Thank you very much, Richard. Thanks very much for having me.
So, Graham, I wanted to start the podcast by tracing back your career history, really. 30 years spent in energy and technology. So we can focus on some of your experiences along the way, which have brought you to where you are today, and also some of your key learnings along the way. Going back right to the start of your career, I understand your academic background was in material physics, and your first role was in the Central Electricity Research Laboratory, working on electrochemical storage. Perhaps you could just say a bit more about that, Graham. And I was interested, was your move into the energy sector an active choice or something you fell into?
So I guess it starts with the fact that my father was an engineer and my mother was a physics teacher. And I ended up being good at maths and physics because of my parents. And so ultimately I ended up doing a physics degree, a material science PhD, basically because I wasn't any good at anything else.
So your first role was in the Central Electricity Research Laboratory, part of what was then the state-run Electricity Generation Board. Can you say a bit more about what you were working on at the time?
Yeah, so I did a PhD in conducting polymers, and I made most of my materials electrochemically. And so I was interested in electrochemistry and polymers, not only electronic conductivity, but also ionic conductivity. And those two types of materials, electrically conducting and ionically conducting polymers, is what you use in fuel cells and electrolysers and batteries. So, that's where I started academically. Went to the Central Electricity Research Labs in Leatherhead and worked on fuel cells, some solid oxide fuel cell work, also on superconductivity, but then particularly on flow cells. So we built at what became National Power. We built a technology called Regenesis, and I went to the States and transferred that technology to National Power. And ultimately, we built a 100 megawatt hour energy store at Little Barford. And that at the time was the world's largest electrochemical energy store. I believe that having opened it in 1999, the record was beaten by Elon's battery at 129 megawatt hours, and that was 20 years later. So it was an early and very, I think, innovative development.
I'm pretty interested in this Regenesis technology you mentioned, Graham. It seems like this was way ahead of its time. There's nothing really else like it around at the time. The Little Barford project you mentioned, 120 megawatt hours, was the largest of its kind in the world at the time, setting a record that's taken decades for the industry to come up with anything larger, with the most recent Tesla batteries. But I understand after developing the project, the companies involved were wound up and the technology went no further. Can you explain how this came about?
So, the rationale back then for energy storage wasn't what it is today. Today, it's about storing renewable power. Back then, it was about turning mid-merit plant into peaking plant, into baseload plant, and eliminating peaking plant. So it was all about rebalancing a portfolio, not using peaking plant, which is not only very carbonizing, but isn't often used. They're very scantily used assets. So Regenesis was an incredibly important project in the UK. 100 megawatt hour energy store was a very, very significant early development. Actually, the reason that the technology didn't continue was that RWE bought National Power. And in buying National Power, they reassessed the strategy for energy storage. And the strategy back then was all about turning mid-merit plant into baseload plant and eliminating peaking plant. So it was about storing for periods of around 10 hours. And so the project and the development was terminated by RWE. So it's interesting looking back now that, if RWE had continued with that development, they would have been in advance of most other companies in terms of energy storage technology, because of course today the rationale for energy storage is incredibly strong, and the rationale is storing renewable power and trying to deal with renewable intermittency on the network.
So as you say, Graham, people are still working on those longer duration storage technologies and models of sort of 10 hours and above, even today, some 20 to 30 years later from those early projects that you were involved in. I'm interested in your move then, Graham. You mentioned from the CEGB through to what was then National Power and subsequently International Power. This was during the period of privatisation of the GB electricity industry in the early 1990s, which is kind of a pivotal moment in the development of the industry as we now know it, with the CEGB splitting into separate regional electricity companies, which later became the Big Six and National Grid. I was just wondering, so to what extent did privatisation process affect the sort of working environment around you? So, for example, the working style or incentives for you and your team?
I mean, I at the end of my time at National Power, I moved to International Power. I was one of the business development managers at International Power. And I spent my time in Eastern Europe looking at acquisitions. So not only looking at the acquisitions of power stations, but also some of the emerging companies in Eastern Europe. So I was development manager working in the Czech Republic, in Bulgaria, Romania, and in Poland. And my work was very, very different. I have to say that not having a technology development element to the work was not something that I particularly enjoyed.
So Graham, if I trace your later career history correctly, you then went down a more technology path, becoming the CEO of a number of different university spin-out technology companies. Was that a conscious choice to get back towards your sort of technology and innovation background?
Yeah, it was partly that. It was partly a desire to take a more entrepreneurial look at life, start something right from the beginning, something with a high level of technical input, but also I was very interested in raising money and developing companies and looking at being a CEO of a small company to get that experience. So Antonova was a DRA, a dielectric resonating antenna. It was a smart antenna for mobile phones. So it had a lot of technology in it, but also I had to raise venture capital for the company and develop the company. And that was an incredible challenge. And anyone who's done a technology startup company knows the challenges of raising venture capital and scaling the company and launching a product. And actually trying to launch a product and get it into a handset was a difficult journey. And actually Antonova still exists today, is still making smart antennas for mobile devices. So it was a successful development. And I then got offered the opportunity to spin Metallisis out of Cambridge University, which was scaling up a piece of electrochemistry. Actually, that development was about the electrochemical, the molten salt electrochemical reduction of metal oxides to metals, and particularly a process that was particularly directed towards titanium and tantalum. And tantalum, of course, is the metal powder that you use in supercapacitors. So again, a piece of energy storage technology, but then looking at the supply chain and the metal powders that are used in the supercapacitors. And then after Metallisis, I was the CEO of Universal Sensors, which became Vantix. And Universal Sensors made a conducting polymer electrochemical sensor to look at industrial diagnostics, and was an incredibly versatile antenna. But that used a conducting polymer material, again, which goes back to some of my experience of producing conducting polymers electrochemically. So I think that the theme throughout has been electrochemistry, materials, and actually developing companies and raising money.
So it seems all of your various different roles that you've had over your career come together really in your current role as the CEO of ITM Power. As I sort of mentioned right at the start, it seems ITM's become a real darling within the green tech investment space. It's grown so rapidly, with the share price rising 20-fold over the last 2 years, as I can see, leading to your current market capitalization. Could you say a bit about the journey that you've been through in your 12 years at ITM? What did the company look like when you joined? And what are the key things that you and the team have done to build it to where it is today? And sort of what were the key challenges that you face, I guess, in getting to where you are?
Yeah, so ITM Power 12 years ago was an R&D company. It didn't have products. It didn't have an ISO accredited manufacturing facility. A great group of technical people with fantastic technology, but no products and no revenues. So the first thing that I did was get the facility ISO accredited. We then defined and launched our first product in 2011. But when I say defined and launched the product, that means going through the process of CE marking the product so it could be sold under that regulation and compliance. So we did that in 2011. We produced units that were around 10 kilowatts in size, and we launched them at Hanover. And actually, if you fast forward by 1 decade, so if you fast forward 10 years, we're now quoting on a regular basis 100 megawatt units. So we scaled up in the last decade by 4 orders of magnitude, by 10,000 times, from 10 kilowatts up to 100 megawatts. We are Our largest deployment today is at the Rhineland refinery. That's 10 megawatts. So that's a scale up of 3 orders of magnitude. And we're quoting at the next order of magnitude right now. So it has been an amazing journey. We have been developing ITM electrolysis for 20 years. We've been in the green hydrogen industry for 20 years. We've been advocating power to gas energy storage. I personally have been advocating that for 30 years. And yes, it's been a long journey. What's changed? The key thing that's changed is that we now have net zero targets. And green hydrogen is the only net zero energy gas. So if you want to replace grey hydrogen that's used in industry, or if you want to replace natural gas in the gas grid with something, or indeed if you want to replace petrol and diesel for heavy vehicles in transport, the only net zero energy gas is green hydrogen. And at the same time, of course, the cost of renewable power has come down. So the cost of green hydrogen has come down because they're inextricably linked. And as the cost of renewable power comes down, of course, the volume goes up and the need for energy storage goes up. So you have cost reduction, industrial need, and government policy, all pointing in the same direction.
It seems, Graham, that there was an inflection point in the company's journey and also the journey for hydrogen as a technology around 2019. I guess this is the point when everyone starts talking about net zero. That's the key difference. The UK government legislated for its net zero target in 2019. And with setting that target, in my mind, it became clear that all industries would have to play a role in getting to net zero. So in a sense, there was nowhere to hide for the most polluting sectors if the target is zero rather than the 80% reduction that we had previously. And with hydrogen sort of playing an important role in the decarbonisation of those harder to abate sectors, it seems to me that was a key turning point for the fortunes of ITM and power and hydrogen as a technology as well. So for you, this is when you announced the Besmer Park gigastack facility, lots of fundraising activity with Snam and Linde. It seems like everything started to come together for ITM around this time.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, when you look at development in any process and the city and the adoption in industry and also the understanding of governments are all similar. They're not linear. You don't start from one point and gradually increase. What happens is you go through a paradigm shift, and you're absolutely right. There was an inflection point where we developed the relationship with Shell to the point we did the Rhineland refinery project. We made a very significant step when we partnered with Linde, formed a joint venture with Linde, and Linde became a strategic investor. When we moved into Besmer Park, and when we consolidated the relationship with Snam and that strategic investment as well. So I would agree with your analysis, and there was an inflection point certainly, but it was an inflection point not just for ITM, and it was an inflection point for the whole energy transition, and also for green hydrogen in general.
Yeah, and I guess from an Aurora perspective, this is when we also started to see a real uptick in interest from clients in hydrogen, hence our move to provide more and more research on the potential of hydrogen, the investable business models, and also the impact of hydrogen on energy markets and other asset classes such as renewables. Can I ask just a bit more about your Besmer Park electrolyser production facility? So on paper, it's described as having capacity of 1 gigawatt per annum, but I understand it's not producing that much currently. So what needs to happen to get it to its full potential? Is that about demand picking up in the form of more orders, or is it more on the supply side for ITM to further automate its processes and scale up production?
Yeah, no, it's about orders. It's very old-fashioned stuff, Richard. It's about order intake. It's about cracking through those orders, delivering on projects. So today we have a backlog of 124 million of projects, and we need to go through the process of delivering all of those first of all and recognizing the revenue. We quote a thing called our tender pipeline. This is the number of tenders that we make against, sorry, the number of quotations that we make against commercial tenders. And over the last 12 months, we've tendered 435 million pounds worth of equipment. So it is about turning those quotations into orders, and it's about building that equipment and increasing the throughput through our factory. So, but we've installed, moved into a gigawatt factory, installed production, because we're looking at gigawatt scale targets. So you have a target for hydrogen in the UK of 5 gigawatts. You have 40 gigawatts target in Europe, with 6 gigawatts over the next 4 years in Europe. You can't close a deal in the hundreds of megawatts to gigawatts of scale unless you've got the production in place already. You can't say, I'll offer you a quotation for that project unless you can show the customer that you can manufacture it. And it's that way around. So you have to have the capacity first so that you have the ability to execute on those orders. And that's what we've done at ITM. And we've been able to do that because we've been backed by the City of London. So the capital markets, I mean, if you take our funding round in October of last year, we raised 172 million, and it was 2.5 times oversubscribed. And actually the city is now incredibly well informed about the energy transition, about energy storage, about the use of green hydrogen, power to X, and about decarbonising industry, and has been and is now incredibly supportive of electrolyzer and green hydrogen companies.
So, Graham, it sounds like an incredible story. Just thinking about that 124 million order backlog you have and the 400 million tender pipeline you mentioned as well. Who are the typical buyers of the electrolyzers you produce? And also, what are the typical use cases? I imagine the predominant business model is really around industrial applications for hydrogen usage, replacing grey hydrogen with green. Is that correct, or are there other business models people are looking at?
Yeah, so if you look at the breakdown, I mean, we put that number out, that tender opportunity pipeline number out, to give the capital markets an indication of what the growth of interest in electrolyzers and green hydrogen is. We do actually break it down into sectors and even into regions. And so I can tell you that about half of it is in the energy space, so power to gas, energy storage, and other energy applications. Around a quarter is in industry, but industry is the most significant early adoption market. And the reason that industry is a smaller subset is because industry projects are always led with FEED studies. It's a front-end engineering design study. We don't include that in the tender pipeline, but we are doing FEED studies now that will lead to, or could potentially lead to multi-hundred megawatt installations in industry. So just to give you a sizing of this, Europe uses 400 terawatt hours a year of grey hydrogen. That's hydrogen made from natural gas. And the industries are refining, ammonia, methanol, and metals treatment. And that's the entry market for green hydrogen, because you can put an electrolyzer down right next to those industrial demand centers, make green hydrogen and do a direct replacement. And actually refineries are included in the Renewable Energy Directive. So refineries have a requirement to make 14% of their product renewably in the next decade. So they are developing as the early entry market, and we're delighted to have a reference plant with Shell at the Rhineland refinery, and doing the feed study with Phillips 66 at the refinery in the Humberside, and also the chemical plant in Leuna with Linde. So I think we've got a fantastic reference plant and then a developing deal pipeline. Exactly the place in industry where you need to utilize green hydrogen.
Looking further out then, you mentioned the multi-gigawatt potential market across Europe and globally, and the European target of 40 gigawatts of electrolysers for 2030. I'm sure ITM will be wanting to take a good share of that market. Are you already thinking about production facilities beyond Besmer Park to realise this potential?
Yeah, I mean, Bessemer Park is semi-automated, and we'll be looking at automating some of the other processes. So there's potential to increase the capacity at Bessemer Park right now. We raised enough money in the funding round to be able to build a second gigafactory, a larger one, actually, something between 1.5 and 2 gigawatts in size. And we'll look at pulling the trigger on that second gigafactory when the first one gets to 60% capacity. So yeah, we have secured enough capital already to be able to do that expansion.
Also, just thinking about that 40 gigawatt target, what sort of government support do you think is needed to get there and to sort of pull through the demand for your product? Is that something that's just going to be happening naturally, driven by the economics, or are there specific government policies that you're keen to see coming through?
So I think the adoption of green hydrogen and replacing grey hydrogen with green hydrogen, or indeed replacing natural gas with green hydrogen, needs an incentive in the early days, like any technology where it's at a lower scale than the incumbent industry. And we are hugely smaller as an industry than the natural gas industry or the grey hydrogen industry is today. And the way you do that is with contracts for difference auctions. And these have been announced across Europe. Actually, the first announcement about an annual CFD for green hydrogen was made by the German government. Then the EU announced that there was 100 billion over the next decade for contracts for difference auctions for green hydrogen. That's 10 billion a year for 10 years. And then you had the announcement of all of the strategies across other nations. I'll give you examples. Germany at 5 gigawatts, Holland at 4, Portugal at 2, France at 6, Spain at 4, for instance. We had some big announcements outside of Europe as well, like the target in Chile, 25 gigawatts over the next decade. The UK government is at the point of developing its hydrogen strategy and articulating that. But the key thing about the hydrogen strategies is developing the business model. So that means incentivizing the revenue model in the early days. And the industry needs incentives, but only for a limited time. So a decade will be enough for the incentives to get us to the point where green hydrogen is lower cost, certainly lower cost than blue hydrogen, which it is today at 4 pence per kilowatt hour, but as low cost as methane. And actually, if you look at Bloomberg New Energy Finance and Platts and other market commentators, they say that by the end of the 2030s, hydrogen will be across Europe at around $1.5 to $1.6 per kilogram, and going from 2030 to 2050, $0.8 per kilogram. So you have a net zero energy gas that competes with natural gas in a range between $6 and $12 per MMBTU. You now have a genuine energy transition. because the largest energy vector on the planet is natural gas. And if you can compete on price with natural gas, with the net zero energy gas, then it's game on for decarbonising heat, transport, industry, a very, very important development. But in the early days, we need some incentive to get volume to decrease costs.
So, Graham, just a couple of final questions. You mentioned the UK's plans around hydrogen. Obviously, at the moment, we don't yet have a clear hydrogen strategy, although some policies have emerged already from Boris's 10-point plan and the energy white paper. And the government says it will release a hydrogen strategy shortly in spring of this year. Do you think the UK has been ambitious enough so far? And what are you hoping to see in this strategy that's coming out soon?
So I was delighted to see Boris's 10-point plan. Point one, 40 gigawatts of new offshore wind and 0.25 gigawatts of hydrogen. Fantastic first two bullet points if you want to really decarbonize industry. And actually, it shows some joined up thinking in energy, because it goes from power to gas. That means you can decarbonize industry with renewables as well. What do I hope? I hope that there's a significant portion of that 5 gigawatts of clean hydrogen, as it's referred to, is green hydrogen and is electrolysers, and represents long-term energy storage. You know, we talked about Regenesis earlier. Regenesis was a power in, power out energy storage device. Actually, what we've learned, and I think adoption in the industry is very rapid, is that if you want huge volume, long duration energy storage, the best way of doing it is to turn electrons, which are very, very difficult to store, into molecules, which are very easy to store. And we've been doing that for hundreds of years. So-called power to X, or green hydrogen, using electrolysis to convert electrons to molecules, is not only joined up energy thinking between offshore wind, which needs energy storage, but it also means that you can decarbonize those areas of industry that need net zero molecules, not just net zero electrons.
Thanks so much, Graham. It's been fascinating to talk to you, tracing your career story and how it's all come together in this role in ITM Power. I think you've painted a really positive and optimistic vision, both for the hydrogen sector and also for ITM as a company. So thanks a lot for coming on the podcast, Graham.
No, that's great, Richard. And thank you very much for inviting me.
That was Richard Howard, Aurora's Research Director, talking to Graham Cooley, CEO of ITM Power. Do keep an eye on our podcast feed for more in-depth conversations with senior members of the energy industry. The best way to do this is to subscribe on whatever platform you use. Thanks for listening and goodbye.